A single phone call shattered the quiet life I'd clung to for years, dragging buried memories and unanswered questions crashing back. The past didn't stay buried. It waited, patient and unforgiving, until the moment it could break through. In a room full of strangers and whispered judgments, I faced a truth that rewrote everything I believed about family, loss, and forgiveness. This story isn't just about what was taken or given. It's about what remains when everything else falls away. If you're ready to hear how a broken man found a chance at redemption, like this video, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. I want to hear your story too. My name is Walter Pierce. I'm 65 years old, semi-retired, and living alone in a modest apartment on the east side of Casper, Wyoming. It's not much, one bedroom, a leaky faucet, and a coffee maker that gives up halfway through most mornings, but it's mine. I wake up every day around 6:30, feed the neighbor's cat if she's traveling, and walk a few laps around the block before the wind kicks up. My life is quiet, predictable, and mostly unremarkable. That's why I remember exactly how strange it felt when everything changed with a phone call I almost didn't answer. The mug slipped out of my hand first. It hit the floor and shattered like a gunshot in the silence, splashing lukewarm coffee across the yellow linoleum. I knelt down with a dish towel and was still crouched there wiping up the mess when the landline rang. Not the cell phone I use for calls to the mechanic or grocery store coupons. The old beige landline plugged into the wall for no good reason other than habit. It rang exactly 5 times before I stood, wiped my hands on my flannel shirt, and picked it up. "Walter Pierce speaking," I said out of reflex. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and female. "Mr. Pierce, this is Diane Whitaker from Kingsley, Holt, and Mason Legal Services in Cheyenne. I'm calling regarding a former client, Miranda Pierce." Her name hit me harder than the shattering mug. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. "Yes." I managed voice tight. "I'm very sorry to inform you," Diane said, "but Mrs. Pierce passed away Monday evening. The funeral service is scheduled for this Friday at 2 p.m. at Fairview Memorial Chapel. Following the service, there will be a reading of the will. You've been named as a beneficiary. Your presence is required." I sat down slowly. The wooden chair creaked beneath me. I felt the world shift slightly beneath my feet, like gravity had changed its rules. "There must be some mistake," I said. "We haven't spoken in over 15 years. "There's no mistake," she replied gently. "Your name appears explicitly in her final documents." I don't remember saying goodbye or hanging up. One minute, I was holding the phone. The next, I was staring at the kitchen wall, Diane's words echoing in my head. Miranda, dead. And somehow, for reasons I couldn't begin to understand, she had left something behind for me. That day passed in a haze. I stepped over the broken mug for hours before sweeping it up. I left the wet towel on the floor until nightfall. I microwaved an old can of soup and forgot to eat it. My mind kept circling the same thought. What could she possibly want me there for? Miranda and I had divorced in 2010, and it hadn't been amicable. 22 years of marriage had ended in silence and legal jargon. She'd gone on to build an empire with her consulting firm. I'd gone back to fixing generators and reading old spy novels. Our son Colton had chosen her world: suits, stocks, and sharp opinions. I hadn't heard from him in 5 years. I convinced myself it didn't hurt, but the truth was it still did. The next morning, I shaved. I found my old suit in the back of the closet, pressed it carefully, and left it hanging by the door. I didn't know if I'd go to the funeral, but something about that call made it impossible to ignore. By Thursday night, I'd vacuumed the apartment, cleaned the kitchen, and written down the address of the chapel twice. My sleep was shallow, filled with dreams of courtroom benches and old wedding photos. When Friday came, it brought gray skies and wind. I stared at myself in a mirror longer than I had in years. My hair had gone almost completely silver. My shoulders drooped a little more than I remembered. Still, I adjusted my tie and nodded once before grabbing my keys. The drive to the chapel took 25 minutes. I passed old gas stations, boarded up diners, and subdivisions I used to know. The closer I got, the more the past pressed in. By the time I turned onto the long, curved driveway of Fairview Memorial, my knuckles were white around the steering wheel. I parked between a Mercedes and a Tesla. I got out, buttoned my coat, and walked up the steps with the weight of history on my shoulders. The chapel was full. Hundreds of people dressed in dark suits, sleek heels, expensive perfume, determined steps. She wasn't just pretty. She was electric, like a live wire had walked into the diner and dared anyone to touch it. She didn't sit. She marched straight up to the counter where the manager, some guy with too much cologne and not enough sense, was sipping coffee behind the register. What she said next echoed across the room as clear as a bell. "You're telling me you won't hire women to manage the weekend shifts because you think we can't handle pressure?" I froze mid-bite. The fork hovered in front of my mouth. The manager mumbled something, probably about policy or tradition or some nonsense about late-night safety. She cut him off mid-sentence. "That's not just outdated. That's illegal." Her voice was sharp, not angry but precise, like a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. She pulled a business card from her purse and slid it across the counter. "When you're ready to hire based on qualifications instead of assumptions, give me a call." And then, as suddenly as she appeared, she turned and walked out. But not before glancing sideways and locking eyes with me for one heartbeat. Just one. Long enough to register my dropped jaw and half-eaten pie. She didn't smile, but her eyebrows lifted slightly like she was daring me to say something clever. I didn't. I watched her walk out, then stared through the frosted glass as she climbed into a blue Honda Civic, adjusted her mirrors twice, and drove away. The diner felt dull after that, like she'd taken the air with her. I left a $5 bill on the table and walked out with the manager still muttering behind the counter. I memorized her name off the business card she'd left. Miranda Chong, business consultant. It took me 3 days to call her. I must have rehearsed the opening line 100 times. When I finally dialed the number, my hand was sweating and I nearly hung up after the first ring. But on the second, she answered. Miranda Chong. Her voice was exactly as I remembered it. Confident, grounded. I cleared my throat. "Hi, this is Walter Pierce. We haven't met, but I saw you at Murphy's Diner Wednesday night." There was a pause. Then she said, "The man with the apple pie who watched me lecture the manager?" I laughed, caught off guard. "You saw me. I was getting my gloves from the car. You left a good tip." Her voice softened just slightly. "So what can I do for you, Mr. Pierce?" I took a breath. "Dinner. Somewhere with better pie." Another pause. "Are you asking me on a date? Or do you need business advice?" "Definitely a date. But if you got tips for impressing extraordinary women, I'm open to consulting fees." She laughed, and I swear I felt it through the phone. A week later, we had dinner at Romano's on 3rd. She wore the same red coat, but under it was a black dress that made my brain stutter. I showed up in my best shirt and my only tie. We talked for 3 hours. About everything. Her childhood in Sacramento. My job at the plant. Our mutual love for black and white movies and hardcover books. I told her about a time I nearly flooded my apartment trying to fix a sink. She told me about getting detention in high school for correcting her civics teacher. When we left the restaurant, it was snowing lightly. I offered her my jacket. She refused. "I don't get cold," she said. "I get focused." I proposed to her 6 months later in that same diner where we first met. I had the ring in my pocket, ordered the same pie, and waited until the manager stepped away before sliding the box across the table. "Marry me, Miranda Chong. Make me the happiest man in Wyoming." She said yes before I finished the sentence. Our wedding was in September, under a sky so blue it looked artificial. She wore her grandmother's dress, altered to fit her perfectly, and carried wildflowers we'd picked together that morning. I remember her smile as I slid the ring onto her finger. Forever, she whispered, and I believed her. 2 years later, our son Colton was born. She held him like she'd been preparing her whole life to be someone's mother. I remember looking at them in that hospital room, my hand on her shoulder, the baby swaddled between us, and thinking, this is it. This is everything I'll ever need. For a while, it was true. She worked hard, harder than anyone I knew, and I believed that whatever she earned, she deserved. The company began with a folding table in our guest room and a whiteboard we picked up secondhand from a school auction. I installed track lighting to help her concentrate, and we'd have late-night conversations about branding, client acquisition, and market trends I barely understood, but listened to anyway because her eyes lit up when she talked. At first, I thought it was a phase, a passionate detour, something that would eventually fold back into our shared life. But it didn't. It grew. She got her first big client just after Colton's 5th birthday. I remember because she missed his party to close the deal. I held the cake while a magician we'd hired made balloon animals, and Colton kept glancing at the door, asking when Mommy would be home. I told him she'd come soon, but she never made it. That night, when she walked in past 10, still in heels, exhausted but glowing, she kissed his forehead while he slept and whispered that everything was going to change. And it did. We moved to a larger house with columns and a circular driveway. Her company, now named Pierce Strategic Solutions, landed government contracts and major accounts. The guest room office became a downtown suite with a receptionist and glass walls. I stayed at the plant, not because I lacked ambition, but because I loved my job. There was something grounding about machinery, about systems that either worked or didn't, about the logic of electricity. It made sense to me in a way the corporate world never did. But the more Miranda climbed, the more I felt like I was shrinking in her rearview mirror. She'd host dinner parties for clients and partners, nights where the table was set with crystal and the food came with plating instructions. I'd sit quietly, smiling, nodding along to conversations about capital flows, mergers, and leveraged assets, all while wondering when I'd stopped being her equal and started becoming her accessory. Once someone asked her what I did, and she said, "Oh, Walter, he keeps the lights on," with a laugh. It was meant as a joke, but it stung. I wasn't ashamed of my job. I was ashamed of how small it seemed next to hers. Colton, meanwhile, was evolving into a miniature version of her. He had her sharp eyes, her unshakable confidence, her drive. At 10, he was coding websites. At 12, he was attending leadership camps in Colorado. At 14, he could recite the principles of market efficiency faster than he could recite the Pledge of Allegiance. I tried to connect with him the way my dad had connected with me, fishing, working on bikes, fixing things around the house. But Colton wasn't interested in any of that. He wanted structured projects, technology, progress. Once, I suggested we build a birdhouse together, and he asked if we could just 3D print one instead. Miranda encouraged this. She said we needed to prepare him for the world, that childhood was no longer a place for sentiment, but strategy. I disagreed quietly at first, then louder, but it didn't matter. She had a plan, and it didn't include my nostalgia. One summer, I took a week off work to go camping, just me and Colton. I packed the car with supplies, borrowed a friend's kayak, and picked up a book about stargazing for kids. The night before we were supposed to leave, Miranda told me she'd signed him up for a junior entrepreneur boot camp in Denver. "It'll look amazing on his college applications," she said, as if that were the only metric for his happiness. I didn't fight her, not because I agreed, but because I was tired of losing battles that felt like they shouldn't have been battles at all. I watched them go that morning, my son waving absently from the back seat of her Lexus while I stood by the garage, holding two fishing poles that would never be used. That was the first time I felt truly alone in my own family. It wasn't that they had left me behind. It was that they didn't seem to notice I wasn't coming with them. Our arguments started to take on a rhythm, like a script we both knew by heart. I'd say we were losing something. She'd say we were building something. I'd say I missed family dinners. She'd say she missed deadlines. We were fluent in opposing languages. I remember one night standing outside our house, looking at the lit up windows and thinking how beautiful it looked from the outside, how polished and perfect and hollow it had all become. Inside was a son who no longer came to me for advice, a wife who came home in silence, and a man who no longer recognized his own reflection in the glass. That silence grew into distance. I stopped trying to decode her calendar. She stopped asking about my day. Colton stopped looking up from his tablet long enough to notice who was in the room. We were no longer a family. We were a system, efficient, well-funded, and emotionally bankrupt. I began spending more time alone. Sometimes I'd drive to the lake and sit there for hours with a thermos of coffee. Not fishing, not thinking, just sitting. I needed space to remember who I was outside of Miranda's shadow. I stopped going to the dinner parties. She stopped inviting me. Miranda sat across from me in a tailored suit that cost more than my monthly salary, flipping casually through the documents while her attorney, a man with a permanent smirk and a silver pen, outlined the terms like he was reading off a lunch order. I wore a shirt that didn't quite fit and shoes I'd forgotten to polish. No one looked me in the eye. The split itself was straightforward. Miranda took the company. Naturally, Pierce Strategic Solutions had grown into a seven-figure operation by then, with contracts stretching across 4 states and a growing foothold in international markets. She retained ownership of our main residence in Westview Estates, a place with 10-foot ceilings, imported countertops, and a wine cellar I never entered. She also kept the second home in Jackson Hole, the one we bought during a brief attempt at reconciliation when Colton was 12. I got the old starter home on Maple Street, the one we'd once rented during our first year of marriage and later kept as a rental property. It was a 2-bedroom with drafty windows, creaky floors, and a front porch swing that needed repainting. Somehow it suited me better than anything else we'd ever owned. The financial settlement was enough to keep me afloat, but not enough to rebuild. I didn't argue. I didn't want more. I just wanted out. Not from her, but from the life we had built that no longer resembled anything I recognized. Colton was 18 at the time, preparing to head off to college. He didn't speak to me during the process. When I tried to explain things to him, to tell him that relationships are complicated, that his mother and I had simply become two people walking different paths, he stared at me like I was an alien. "You're just bitter because you never wanted her to succeed," he said, and that cut deeper than any of the legal proceedings. I didn't correct him. What was the point? In his eyes, I was the failure, the man who couldn't keep up, who chose mediocrity over ambition. He moved in with Miranda full-time shortly after. I helped him load his things into her SUV, then watched them drive away without looking back. The silence that followed was louder than any argument we'd ever had. For a while, I tried to keep a connection. I'd send texts, updates about the house, photos of the dog we used to have, memories from when he was a kid. Sometimes I got a thanks or a cool, but mostly I got nothing. Then came the birthday, I forgot to call him. I was working a double shift, the power station was overloaded due to a winter storm, and by the time I got home, my back hurt too much to think. I remembered 2 days later. When I called, his voicemail was full. I never heard from him again. After that, I stopped reaching out. Not because I stopped caring, but because I was tired of feeling like an interruption in his life. The Maple Street house became my world. I fixed the leaky faucet. I planted tomatoes in the backyard. I built bookshelves and started collecting old maps. I stopped going to places where people might ask me about Miranda or Colton. I wasn't ashamed, I was exhausted. I'd spent 20 years being a husband and a father, only to realize I was a ghost in both roles. Miranda thrived in her new life. Every now and then, her name would pop up in a business journal or on a local news segment. Strategic genius, they called her. Self-made CEO. I watched once as she accepted an award at a Women in Business gala, standing on a stage in a blue dress that shimmered under the lights. She thanked her team. She thanked her son. She didn't mention me. I didn't expect her to. I wasn't part of that version of her story. In her world, I was the man she overcame, the past she left behind on her climb to the top. That narrative played well in interviews and networking circles. And if I'm honest, maybe I was that man for a time. Maybe I didn't push hard enough. Maybe I was too content with enough. Still, it didn't erase the years we spent building something together before it unraveled. I thought about those years often, in the quiet moments, sitting on the porch in the early morning when the streets were still empty, or in bed at night staring at the ceiling fan, remembering the sound of her laugh before it turned into something strained. I never dated again. I told myself it was because I didn't want to complicate things, but the truth was simpler. I never stopped loving her, even after she stopped loving me. People don't talk about that part. The love that stays even after the marriage ends, the kind that doesn't fade so much as settle into your bones. Life moved on, but I stayed still. I got older. My hands got stiffer. I learned to cook better meals and discovered a fondness for jazz I never had before. The neighbors came and went, younger families with kids who didn't wave. I didn't mind. I had my routines, my space, my silence. I told myself I was at peace. But sometimes late at night, I'd wonder if they ever thought about me, Miranda or Colton. Did she ever regret the distance? Did he ever miss me, even for a second? I'd never know, and I had accepted that, until that phone call came, slicing through the fog of years and dragging me back into a story I thought was finished. The chapel smelled of lilies and polished wood. The light through the stained glass painted soft colors across the pews, and the low hum of murmured conversation reminded me of church services we used to attend when Colton was young. People turned as I walked in, their eyes traveling quickly from my suit to my face, trying to place me. Some did immediately, and their expressions soured. Others whispered behind their hands, nudging each other as if I were a curiosity, a ghost materialized in the flesh. I kept my gaze forward, moved down the aisle, and slipped into the last pew like a shadow. My hands folded neatly in my lap, but my heart was hammering. I had prepared for cold shoulders. I had not prepared for Colton. He didn't see me at first, too busy shaking hands and accepting condolences with the polished demeanor of someone raised in boardrooms instead of backyards. At 37, he looked every bit the product of Miranda's world. Tall, handsome, sharply dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my car. He stood near the casket with an air of authority that made people step back when he passed. When his eyes finally found me, the air seemed to shift. His expression hardened instantly, and he began walking toward me, each step deliberate and heavy. I stood instinctively, unsure of what to expect, but what came next wasn't a greeting. It was a performance. His voice, low at first, rose with every sentence, slicing through the murmur of the crowd like a scalpel. "What are you doing here?" he asked loudly enough for those nearby to hear. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out fast enough. "You don't belong here," he continued. "You lost that right 15 years ago." A hush fell across the room. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. The minister paused mid-sentence. I tried to keep my voice calm. "Colton, I came to pay my respects. I didn't come to cause trouble." He shook his head, lips curling in contempt. Don't pretend this is about respect. You embarrassed her when she was alive, and now you want to embarrass her in death. He gestured around us, sweeping the crowd into his attack. This man, he announced, was the anchor around my mother's neck. While she built an empire, he changed light bulbs and moped about mediocrity. He didn't support her dreams. He resented them. I stood frozen, heart pounding so loud it nearly drowned out the words. People around us shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to watch even as they stared openly. My fingers twitched at my side. I wanted to defend myself, to remind him that I had loved her before the empire, when we were just two broke kids chasing dreams over diner pie. I wanted to tell him that I had supported her in all the ways that didn't make headlines, that I had stayed up nights with him when he had a fever while she closed deals in another city. But I said nothing, because nothing I said would undo the narrative he had built in her image. He took from her. Colton continued, his voice shaking now with emotion. He walked away from us, and now he shows up like some grieving widower looking for a spotlight. It's pathetic. A few gasps whispered through the crowd. Someone coughed. Someone else murmured, "Not the time," under their breath. But no one stopped him. No one came to my defense. I looked at Colton, really looked at him, and for the first time I didn't see my son. I saw a man who had grown up idolizing half the story. He knew her ambition, but not her exhaustion. He knew her power, but not her pain. He had seen the empire, but missed the crumbling foundation beneath it. "Are you done?" I asked quietly. The words slipped out before I could stop them. He blinked, surprised by my tone. "I loved your mother," I said, voice calm but clear. "I loved her when she was just Miranda, before the awards, before the articles, before the company. I stood by her when no one else believed in her, and even after she left, I still hoped she'd find what she was looking for." I turned slightly, not toward him, but toward the casket. "I'm not here for you," I added. "I'm here for her." I sat back down without waiting for permission. He stood there a moment longer, fuming, unsure what to say next. Eventually, someone touched his arm, whispered something, and he returned to the front of the chapel. The service resumed, but the mood had changed. The air was tight. People avoided looking in my direction. Some glanced over, eyes filled with pity or discomfort. But I didn't move. I kept my hands folded. I listened to the eulogy. I watched the slideshow of her life, the vacations, the speeches, the gala events. My face wasn't in a single photo. Neither was Maple Street. Neither was our old porch swing. But I stayed until the final hymn. I stayed because some part of her had invited me. Because even though I had been erased from her public life, she had, in death, left a space for me in the room. My jaw was tight, not from anger, but from holding back everything I could have said, but chose not to. I had almost made it to the steps when a man in a dark gray suit intercepted me with a polite, practiced smile. "Mr. Pierce?" he asked, extending a hand. "Dale Kingsley. I'm Miranda's attorney." We spoke on the phone. I shook his hand, surprised at how firm his grip was, how warm. He looked like someone who played golf with senators, but still carried his own briefcase. "I didn't expect to see you out here," I said. He nodded, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. "We try to be present for our clients' final arrangements. Miranda was with our firm for over a decade. She was meticulous about details." I gave him a tight smile. That sounded like her. "I'm on my way out," I added. Didn't seem like there was much point in staying. Dale tilted his head slightly, the way people do when they're about to say something carefully. "Actually, there's a reason I'm stopping you. The will reading is scheduled for later this afternoon at my office. Miranda asked that both you and Colton be present." I stared at him, my tired brain struggling to parse the statement. "Me?" I asked. "Why?" "We were divorced for 15 years. I haven't spoken to her since 2010. Nevertheless," he said gently, You are explicitly named, and your presence is required. She was very clear about that. I shook my head slowly, still trying to understand. I thought maybe I was just listed for closure, something small. I don't want to make things worse. Dale's smile didn't waver, but I saw something behind his eyes, a flicker of anticipation, maybe even concern. I understand this is complicated, he said, but I assure you it's important. She wouldn't have requested it if it wasn't. Before I could respond, I felt Colton's presence before I saw him. He moved in fast, his voice sharp. Dale, is this really necessary? He asked, standing beside me like a prosecutor ready for trial. He's not family anymore. This doesn't concern him. Dale turned slightly, his tone remaining level. Colton, I know this is a difficult day, but your mother was very specific. Both of you are to attend a reading. No exceptions. Colton's jaw tensed, but he didn't argue further. He simply turned to me with narrowed eyes. Fine, he muttered. Let's get over with. Just don't say anything unless you're asked. He walked off toward the parking lot, leaving me standing there, suddenly colder than the wind could explain. I looked back at Dale. Are you sure she meant me? He nodded. I've never been more sure of anything. 4 o'clock. My office downtown. Here's the address. He handed me a crisp card and turned to greet another attendee before I could ask more questions. I stood there for a moment longer, the card pressed between my fingers like a ticket to a world I no longer belonged to. I almost didn't go. On the drive home, I passed the turn for downtown twice. I pulled into a gas station and sat there, engine off, asking myself what the point of any of it was. What could Miranda possibly have left me that warranted dragging me through one last round of public judgment? A photograph? A letter? An apology? It didn't make sense. We had lived apart for nearly as long as we had lived together. She had rebuilt her life without me. She had erased me from Colton's version of events. Whatever had been between us was long buried beneath a decade of ambition and silence. And yet, she'd written my name. She had, in her final weeks or months, or however long she'd been preparing for this, remembered me. That alone was enough to make me turn the key again and head downtown. Dale's office was in an old brick building with tall windows and ivy creeping along the side. It smelled like wood polish and old books, and the waiting room was all dark leather and quiet classical music. I sat in a chair that swallowed me whole while Colton paced near the window, his phone in his hand, but his attention fixed on me. He didn't say a word, but the contempt rolled off him in waves. When Dale appeared and gestured for us to follow, Colton moved fast, claiming the seat closest to the desk. I took the one slightly off to the side, near a bookcase full of titles I'd never read. Dale sat behind the desk and opened a thick manila folder, the rustle of paper sounding louder than it should have. Thank you both for coming, he began. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge how difficult this is. Your mother left behind a very detailed will, and her instructions were clear. Today's reading will address the core provisions. Colton folded his arms, eyes narrowed. Let's just get to it. Dale nodded and began reading. Colton leaned forward in his chair like a CEO, ready to assume the throne, his fingers steepled together, expression blank, but clearly poised for what he expected to be a windfall. The will of Miranda Elaine Pierce, Dale began, his voice steady, almost reverent, was executed on March 15th of last year and supersedes all previous versions. In this final testament, she makes the following specific bequests. He looked up at both of us briefly before returning to the document. To my beloved son, Colton Andrew Pierce, I leave the family residence located at 941 Summit Street, along with all furnishings, artwork, and personal property therein. Additionally, I bequeath to Colton the sum of $500,000 to be disbursed from my primary investment account within 60 days of probate. Colton's posture remained composed, but I caught the way his eyebrows lifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, and then settled again. He was pleased, maybe even relieved, but something in his jaw tensed. He was waiting for the rest. We all were. Dale turned the page slowly, deliberately. These bequests are subject to the following condition, he said, his tone shifting just enough to make Colton tilt his head. Colton must remain employed by Pierce Strategic Solutions for a period of no less than 2 consecutive years following the execution of this will. Alternatively, if the company is sold or dissolved within that time, the condition is waived. But if he voluntarily resigns, is terminated for cause, or fails to fulfill the minimum duration of employment, the full amount of the cash bequest is to be forfeited, and the ownership of the property at Summit Street is to revert to the estate. Colton's mouth opened slightly, the calculated control slipping for the first time since we'd entered the office. "What?" he said, his voice lower than usual, almost breathless. "That can't be right." Dale kept his eyes on the document. "These were Miranda's explicit instructions," he said. She wanted to ensure that the company remained stable during the transition period and that those who benefited from it were also contributing to its continued success. "I've worked at that company for a decade," Colton said sharply, his composure returning with a vengeance. "I've overseen client accounts, led strategic development teams, represented us internationally. I don't need to prove my loyalty now." Dale finally looked up. "I'm not questioning your loyalty, Colton. I'm simply conveying your mother's conditions." She was concerned about long-term sustainability and continuity. She wanted stability and accountability. She said as much when she revised her will. Colton let out a tight breath, rubbing the bridge of his nose like he was trying to push the logic back into place. "Fine. So I worked there for 2 more years. I already do that anyway. What about the rest of the company? What about controlling interest? That's what I assumed she'd pass on." He turned toward me slightly, but not to include me, only to emphasize that he expected more than just a house and some money. Dale didn't answer right away. He reached for the next section of the will, took a moment to reorient himself, and said, "We'll get to that shortly. But before we do, I want to reiterate that the condition is not symbolic. If you leave the company, if you attempt to transfer your position, or if there's any breach of this requirement, the assets revert immediately. These terms are final and legally binding." Colton sat back, his expression shifting from stunned to irritated to something more calculating. "And she said this was to ensure stability?" he asked. Dale nodded. "Yes. She believed continuity was essential. She wanted to give the company time to adjust. She mentioned that emotional reactions in the wake of her death could lead to impulsive decisions, and she wanted to prevent that." "Right," Colton muttered, his voice edged with sarcasm. "So she trusted me enough to leave me the house and money, but not enough to make decisions on my own." I watched him closely, the way he clenched his jaw, the flicker in his eyes. This wasn't the handout he had expected. He had walked in prepared to inherit an empire. What he got instead was a clause, a leash, a condition, a reminder that control wasn't being handed over as easily as he had assumed. For a long moment, no one said anything. I sat quietly, feeling like an intruder in a conversation that was rapidly unraveling into something much more personal than legal. I didn't know what role I was meant to play yet, but it was clear that whatever had come before, whatever distance or silence had existed between Miranda and me, this inclusion in the will wasn't accidental. She had written these terms with intention. I could feel it. Dale cleared his throat and folded the current page, setting it aside. "There's more," he said. "Additional provisions regarding the company and other assets." Colton narrowed his eyes. "Finally, let's get to it. What about the company? Did she transfer ownership to me formally? Are there instructions for the board? I assume this is just a transition clause." Dale didn't answer immediately. He looked at me, then back at Colton. His expression was still composed, but I saw the tension behind it, the same kind of tension I'd seen in doctors' offices before bad news. Colton was still recovering from the conditional terms attached to his inheritance, but he leaned forward with renewed interest now, assuming the rest of the reading would finally hand him the keys to the kingdom. I knew that look on his face, hungry, proud, prepared to receive. Dale took a moment to scan the next section of the document, then looked up at both of us, his expression still perfectly neutral, but the pause long enough to raise Colton's suspicion. In accordance with the final provisions of her estate, Dale said carefully, Miranda Pierce bequeathed the majority of her remaining assets to her former husband, Walter James Pierce. The room went completely silent. I didn't move. Colton blinked once, then slowly turned his head toward me, disbelief crashing across his features like a wave. He wasn't angry yet. Not yet. His brain hadn't caught up to the sentence. I sat in stunned stillness, waiting for Dale to explain, wondering if I had misunderstood. Specifically, Dale continued, Mrs. Pierce has left Mr. Pierce the sum of $33,500,000 to be transferred from her primary investment accounts and securities portfolio. My heart skipped. My hands went numb. My first reaction wasn't joy or awe. It was denial. No, I thought this is wrong. This is a mistake. I glanced down at my clothes, my old watch, my scuffed shoes, and then over at Colton's tailored suit and leather briefcase, and I wanted to interrupt, to say something to stop the reading before it got further out of control. But Dale wasn't finished. He flipped to the next page with measured calm and continued. Additionally, Mr. Pierce is to receive 65% ownership in Pierce Strategic Solutions, including all subsidiaries, physical assets, intellectual property, and controlling interest. This includes immediate appointment as chairman of the board of directors. Colton's chair scraped back violently against the polished hardwood floor as he bolted upright, face flushed, hands clenched. "What the hell are you talking about?" he shouted. "That's not possible. That's not legal. He doesn't even work there. He hasn't been in the company in his life." Dale didn't flinch. "It is legal, and it is binding. Miranda Pierce personally reviewed and approved these terms in the presence of 2 legal witnesses and a notary public. She also passed a full mental competency evaluation prior to execution to ensure the validity of her decisions." Colton looked at me then, not like a son looking at a father, but like a man betrayed by someone he believed powerless. "What did you do?" he asked through clenched teeth. "What did you say to her? You haven't spoken to her in 15 years, and now you're getting everything." "I didn't do anything," I said quietly, voice shaking. "I didn't even know she was sick. I haven't spoken to her. I didn't ask for this." "Bullshit," he snapped. "She wouldn't leave that kind of money to someone who abandoned her. Someone who vanished." Dale raised a hand, firm but calm. "Colton, I understand this is difficult, but your mother was not manipulated. These were her instructions. She had months to reconsider. She chose not to." "No," Colton said, pacing now, hands gesturing wildly. "No, I don't accept this. She built that company. I helped her. I sacrificed everything." And he just walks back into the picture and gets it all. "I'm not walking back into anything," I said, still unable to fully comprehend what had just been laid in my lap. I thought she hated me. I thought I was a footnote in her story. I came to pay my respects. That's all. Colton was breathing hard now, flushed, furious. "She left you the company. You don't know how to run a business. You don't even understand what she created. You spent your life fixing wires. You couldn't even support her when it mattered." The words stung, but not because they were new. I had said some of them to myself in moments of doubt. I had wondered if I had failed her, failed Colton, failed to grow into the man they both needed. But now, here was proof that For some reason known only to her, Miranda had chosen me. Chosen me to carry on what she'd built, to inherit the responsibility she had once told me I wasn't qualified to share. She must have been confused, Colton said, switching tactics. She must have been sick or medicated or scared. There's no other explanation. Dale's tone remained professional, but firmer now. She was not confused. She was not under duress. She underwent 2 separate evaluations and reviewed the terms multiple times. Then why? Colton asked, voice breaking. Why would she do this to me? I had no answer. Dale looked down at the papers again, flipping toward the final page. She left an explanation, he said. A personal message to be read after the will. Would you like me to read it now? Colton didn't answer. He stood frozen in place, jaw tight, eyes glassy with disbelief. Yes, I said, almost whispering. Please. Dale reached into a side envelope and removed a letter written in Miranda's elegant handwriting. He unfolded it slowly and cleared his throat. To Walter and Colton, he began, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone. And it means the choice I made has probably caused confusion, anger, or worse. So let me explain it the only way I know how completely. The sound of her words, even secondhand, wrapped around the room like a breeze from another lifetime. I closed my eyes for a moment and listened to her voice in my head, remembered the way she used to speak when she was tired, or trying to be gentle, or deeply sure of herself. Walter, the letter continued, I never stopped loving you. Not in the way I used to, not in the way you might remember, but in the way that someone loves the person who taught them the most about honesty, about restraint, about kindness. You gave me something I never fully appreciated while we were together, balance. I needed that again. Dale paused. Colton stared at the floor. I didn't move. Colton, she wrote, you are the most brilliant man I have ever known, but you haven't yet learned the hardest lesson. That leadership is not about power. It's about trust and grace and knowing when to follow. He looked like a man watching a verdict being read, one that would rewrite his entire life. Dale gave a measured nod. This was her last message. She requested to be shared with both of you only after the will was read in full. He glanced at me briefly before beginning to read aloud, his voice steady but respectful. My dearest Walter, if you are reading this, it means I have left this world and you are now in possession of decisions that were difficult but necessary. I know you may be shocked by the extent of what I have left to you and the conditions I have placed upon Colton, but I ask you to hear me out. I swallowed hard, remembering her voice, soft in the mornings, sharp in the boardroom, tender in our early years. I never stopped loving you. Not during our worst fights, not during the cold silence that followed our separation, and not during the years when we barely exchanged more than a glance. Our story was complicated and flawed, but it was ours. You taught me about integrity, patience, and strength that doesn't need to shout to be heard. I was too proud to admit that I needed you, even after I walked away. The words hit me like a wave, warm and devastating. Colton shifted in his seat, swallowing visibly but not interrupting. Colton, the letter continued, you are my brilliant, ambitious son. I have watched you grow into a man who commands rooms and makes decisions with precision. But you have lived your life in the shadow of my success, accepting benefits without fully understanding the weight they carry. I believe you need to learn the value of building from nothing, of responsibility beyond wealth. Dale's voice faltered for a moment, the room hanging on the next lines. That is why I have entrusted Walter with the majority of my estate and control of the company. Walter embodies the quiet strength and moral compass I hope to instill in you both. He never sought to claim what was mine, but he respected what it took to build it. I trust that he will honor this legacy with humility and care. The silence that followed was heavy and complete. I felt tears prick in my eyes, not just for what she had said, but for the love it contained. Love I had never stopped hoping for, love I thought had been replaced by years of distance and misunderstanding. Colton's hands clenched into fists on his knees. "She trusted you," he whispered, voice cracking. "She left everything to you." I looked at him, not as the angry, entitled man from minutes before, but as the son struggling to grasp a truth that challenged everything he believed. "It's not about money," I said softly, surprising even myself. "It's about responsibility." Dale folded the letter carefully and handed it to me. "She asked that you keep the original. She wanted you to have the final word." I nodded, holding the envelope close to my chest. For the first time that day, I felt a connection, not just to Miranda's memory, but to the son I had lost and hoped to find again. Colton looked away, eyes glossy but unreadable. The weight of the moment pressed down on all of us, reshaping the space between father and son, past and future, loss and hope. "What happens now?" Colton finally asked, voice low. Dale smiled faintly. "Now begins the work of transition. There will be paperwork, meetings, and decisions that will require cooperation and, hopefully, healing. Your mother left her legacy with the hope that would build bridges, not walls." I glanced at Colton, then at Dale, and back at the letter in my hands. I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The love and the losses, the ambition and the sacrifice, the years apart that felt like lifetimes. Miranda had given me a gift that I had never expected and a responsibility that I could no longer ignore. It wasn't just the millions, the company shares, or the title. It was the chance to prove her right, that character, patience, and quiet strength mattered more than power and wealth alone. I looked at Colton and saw a man shaped by a different story, a story of success measured by results and recognition, a story I had once hoped to share, but now knew we had lived in parallel worlds. He was angry and hurt, and I didn't blame him. Trust takes time to rebuild, and wounds that deep don't heal with a single letter or legal decree. But I also saw something else, a flicker of hope, a spark of understanding that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. "Colton," I said softly, "I know this isn't what you expected. It's not easy, and I don't expect you to accept it overnight. But I want you to know that I'm not here to take anything away from you. I'm here because your mother believed in me and in us." He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw the conflict behind his eyes, the pride, the resentment, and maybe a glimmer of the son I once knew. "I'm not trying to replace her," I continued. "I'm trying to honor her, to protect what she built, and to find a way to be a father again, if you'll let me." The tension in the room seemed to shift just slightly, as if the weight of old pain had loosened its grip. Dale cleared his throat and reminded us of the work ahead: legal documents to sign, board meetings to attend, and, most importantly, conversations to have. The company was strong, with a dedicated management team that would help with the transition, but the heart of the legacy was now in our hands. I knew the road wouldn't be easy. There would be disagreements, setbacks, and moments when the past threatened to consume the future. But I was ready to face it, not just for Miranda or Colton, but for myself. I had spent years as a bystander in their lives, a silent observer of their success and distance. Now I was part of the story again, this time on my own terms. As I walked out of Dale's office later that day, the sun was setting over Casper, casting long shadows across the streets and rooftops. The air smelled like pine and promise. I folded the letter carefully, tucked it into my jacket pocket, and breathed deeply. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. Hope that love could be rebuilt. Hope that mistakes could be forgiven. hoped that legacy was more than just wealth. It was about the lives we touch and the memories we leave behind. Miranda had seen that. She believed in it. The end. If you found this story meaningful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of the story stood out to you the most? Where are you watching from? Share your impressions in the comments below. Your support means a lot and helps me continue bringing stories that matter.